I want to just cut to the chase and introduce Professor of Philosophy Chris Kaczor. Since earning his PhD from the University of Notre Dame in 1996, he's established a prolific record of publications, as well as being featured on a number of programming on different news channels, such as ABC and NBC and Fox. And tonight he's going to be talking with us about his recent work, The Ethics of Abortion, Women's Rights, Human Life, and the Question of Justice. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, we have Shane here from the bookstore. Hi, Shane.
Hey, everybody.
Please do step over after the talk if you'd like to pick up a copy of the book. And so with that, I'd love to turn it over to our guest of honor and get going. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind introduction and the invitation to speak here. I'm going to be talking today about this book, The Ethics of Abortion, and I just want to begin by saying a little bit about how this book came about. I've been thinking about abortion, actually, believe it or not, since fourth grade. I had snuck out of my house, and I'd gone off with my buddy, and we had a few refreshments with us, and we started talking philosophy, which happens when you have a few drinks. And before you know it, it turned to the subject of abortion, and we started talking about it. And I remember, I never really thought about it before, so we debated back and forth. But I remember kind of being interested. I thought it was kind of an interesting kind of issue. And then when I got older, in college, on college campuses, there were different groups, and people were proposing different things, and I thought about it a little bit more. But I didn't really start thinking about it in a serious, sustained way until actually I was here at LMU. And I was teaching a course on medical ethics, and part of the book, covered this topic, that topic, the other topic, euthanasia, healthcare, this and that. And so one of the sections of the book was on abortion, so of course I had to present it. And in the book they were presenting both sides of the argument. So some of the arguments were in favor of abortion, some of the arguments were against abortion. So in looking over the book, I really started to think about it in a more serious and sustained way. And what I found really, when I read these articles, is that the articles that were talking about why abortion was okay, I found them kind of weak. I thought, this is not making a really great case in favor of abortion. So I started to look into it. And over the course of about 10 years, this book took me about 10 years to write, even though it's kind of short. It took a long, long time to write. Basically, I searched into all the defenses of abortion that I could possibly find in the journals of philosophy, in books, basically not so much the popular street-level discussions, but the kind of scholarly academic discussions. And I looked at all these different discussions, and basically what I found was that I couldn't find any good defense of this view. In other words, a defense that I thought was really stood up to rational criticism. So what I ended up doing is writing a book, this book, that goes through every single pro-choice argument that I could find, and basically shows how all of these arguments end up not really defending the view adequately. So the book is sort of long, obviously, and so what I'm going to do is really cut to the chase and give you my basic argument that's in the book. And then I want to leave most of the time for actually discussion, because I think sometimes the discussion is much more fruitful than just having me drone on and on for an hour or 2 hours or whatever. So let me just, in a real brief way, summarize and encapsulate the chief views that are talked about in this book. It seems to me in the abortion question, we have to think about a number of different questions, but the questions, certainly three questions are really important. And the first question is this: is the fetus, the human being in utero, is this alive? And again, there's some people say no, and some people say yes. Second question is this being a human being? And again, there are some people who say no, and some people that say yes. And then thirdly, if it's alive and if it's a human being, is it the case that all human beings should be accorded equal basic protection or not? Right? Again, some people say yes, some people say no. So let me talk about each one of these questions. The first question, is the human fetus alive? Is it a living being? Well, there's lots of ways to distinguish living beings from non-living beings. So for instance, I'm alive and you're alive, but this book is not alive, and your chair that you're sitting on is not alive. Now, what differentiates these two kinds of beings? Say you and the chair you're sitting on. Well, you are alive, and what is a sign of life? How do we know that you're alive and the chair is not alive? Well, one of the signs of life is that you can assimilate nutrition, right? That is to say, you take something from outside of you, and you assimilate it to your own body and make it your own. So when you eat food, for instance, it's not like this piece of paper on the chair, which is not assimilated, as it were, to the chair. It's not like the chair ingests this piece of paper and makes it part of its own. So one differentiating characteristic between living things and non-living things is living things assimilate nutrients. Secondly, you're a being that grows. And I don't just mean growing in the sense of you grew until you turned 20 or whatever and then you stopped. We're always growing, right? The human body, like all other animal bodies, is always generating cells and losing cells, right? We're always in the process of growth, at least in that sense, renewing our bodily organism. And of course, by contrast, the chair is not growing. You could add something to a chair, like you could, I don't know, paint it a different color, but that's not really the chair growing. That's some exterior force that's adding something to the chair that makes it something else. By contrast, you as a living being have this power of growth. A third difference is this, that you as a living being can die. Whereas chairs can't die. Chairs can be destructed, chairs can be, their shape can be altered and stuff, but only a living thing is capable, right, of becoming dead. Now, if you think about these three characteristics, that is, assimilation of nutrients, growth, and the potentiality of dying, and if you look at a human embryo or human fetus, the human embryo or human fetus has all these three characteristics. That is to say, it does assimilate nutrition. It does grow. And, of course, it's possible to have a miscarriage or an abortion, and it's possible for the human fetus or the human embryo to die. So, from a scientific perspective, the human fetus is a living organism. And again, this is not a matter of religion or faith or Jesus says or the Bible says or the Pope says. This is a matter of scientific fact that the human fetus is a living organism. So, is the human fetus alive? The scientific evidence points very, very strongly in favor of the idea that, yes, it is alive. And there's no scientific evidence whatsoever that a human fetus is non-living, that it's like a chair or whatever. Second question. Is the human fetus a human being? And I mean human being here in a biological sense. That is to say, is a human fetus a living member of the biological species Homo sapiens? And again, it seems to me there's lots of scientific evidence that points to the conclusion that yes, it is a living member of our species. So if you had two different living creatures here, say you had a dog, our family has a dog, Lulu, so you have Lulu and you have you, right? And let's say we weren't sure which species Lulu belonged to. Well, there'd be ways of figuring that out, right? For instance, we could take a DNA sample from Lulu and we could send it to the lab and say, well, what species does this organism belong to? And they would run the test and say, this is a canine species. And if they took a DNA sample from you and put it to the lab and ran it through the test, they'd say, well, this is a human being. Secondly, we could take a blood test, right? We could take some blood from the dog, we could take some blood from you, again, send it off to the lab for testing, and they would say, well, this blood comes from a dog, this blood comes from a human being. Thirdly, we could look at the parentage. That is to say, Lulu's mother was another dog, and Lulu's father was a dog. And then if we look at you or me, to our parents, of course, our parents were human beings. So if we're thinking about the question, is the being in utero a member of our species, that is to say, a member of the species Homo sapiens, again, the answer, from a scientific perspective, free of religious dogma, is yes. That is to say, this creature is a member of the human species. Its blood is human blood. Its DNA is human DNA. Its parentage is human parentage. So it's a member of our species. So this brings us to the third question, which is, should all human beings be respected by everyone and protected by law? Should all human beings, in other words, be protected by law and welcomed in life? And this is not a scientific question. This is a question of politics, and this is a question of ethics. And when we think about the human family, we have a long history. And many, many times in our history, we've divided the human family into two different groups. And we've basically said, okay, well, you, this section of the human family, has basic rights, has basic dignity, and should be protected by law and welcomed in life. But then you, other members of the human family, you really don't count. So, for instance, we had slavery, right? If you're white, well, yes, you have rights, you have dignity, you should be protected. If you're a person of color, a slave, you don't count, right? At other times in your history, if you're a man, you have dignity, you have rights, you deserve legal protection. If you're a woman, no, you're kind of like property, you don't really count. At other times in our history, if you're a particular religion, you're Catholic or you're Protestant, you count, you have rights, you have dignity. Oh, you're not the right religion? I'm sorry, you don't really count anymore. Now, when we look back in history, every single time we've ever divided the human family, every time we've said, well, yes, you certainly count, but you don't really count. Every time we've ever done this, we've made a horrible mistake. When we look back at history, there's not been one time where we've divided the human family in this way and said, you count and you don't count, that we've made the right decision. So in this book, what I advocate for is the ethics of inclusion. That is to say that we ought to respect and protect all human beings, regardless of their race, regardless of their religion, regardless of their location, regardless of their age. All human beings deserve to be protected and respected, not just some. So the case of the book is based both on science and also on basic ethical principles that I hold to be true. And nothing in this book appeals in any way whatsoever to faith or to religious dogma or to what the Pope says or to what the Bible says or anything like that. Now, if you are a person of faith, well then you would, if you're at least a follower of Jesus, you would follow an ethics of inclusion. It's very clear, at least how I read Scripture, that Jesus reached out and wanted to include everyone. So I do think if you're a person of faith, you have an extra reason beyond just the scientific and moral reasons to be in favor of the pro-life view. But in this book, I'm focusing solely and only and exclusively on arguments that can be accepted by a person of any faith or no faith whatsoever. An atheist, a Muslim, a Catholic, it doesn't matter. The case I'm trying to make in favor of ethics of inclusion is something that can appeal to everyone, whatever their view is. Okay, so that's basically the summary of the book. And I won't bother, I could if you want to, I could go through and talk about all the individual pro-choice views, but I'd much rather hear your questions and your objections because I could go over whoever's view, but they're not presumably not here. I'd rather talk about whatever interests and concerns and questions and objections you have, right here, because those are more important to me, obviously, than someone who's not even here. So, so any questions, objections? Yeah.
So,
Dr. Train.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Dr. Kaczor. I've got one sort of trivial comment and then sort of a real question, which you probably have covered in the book, but I'm curious. So it just seems to me like, to some degree, the third criteria for a being being a living being, it's not tautological, but it sort of strikes me as part of the definition. To say that something can die already assumes that it's alive,
That's
so
right.
to speak. So,
That's right.
Certainly that's true. I'm just not sure how much it adds to the definition of life. My more curious and probing question is, what would be the response to a pro-choice person who suggested that the life of the fetus in utero was a human life, but it was a different sort of human life? Symbiotic isn't quite the right word, but the analogy I was thinking in my head is conjoined twins, right? Where sometimes the well-being of one of the conjoined twins has to be sacrificed for the other conjoined twins. And so that's just an analogy, it's not a real argument, but do people make those sorts of arguments?
Yeah, well, let me talk about both issues. I think you're absolutely right that to be alive, I think if you think about it carefully, or to be able to die, is something that almost all beings that are alive do have. I don't think necessarily by definition to be alive means that you're capable of death, because I think you might agree that there are some beings that are alive that wouldn't be capable of death. So I don't think by definition to be alive means to be subject to death. But I would say, and the reason I mention that is that if a being can die, undoubtedly it's alive.
Okay.
So that's my point. And it seems very, very clear that a human embryo can die, a human fetus can die, a human newborn can die. So death is something that human beings are subject to at every stage of development. You can die. You could have died when you were an embryo. You could have died in utero. You could have died as a newborn. You could have died when you were 6, 13, 40, whatever. So to be subject to death is part of, at least for human beings, part of what it is. All living human beings are subject to death. In terms of your second question, what I'd say is one of the arguments that pro-choice people do give is that the difference between, everybody agrees that you and I in this room have rights to live. So the pro-choice view depends on drawing some sort of distinction between you, right here and now, and you when you were in your mother's uterus, before you were born. Right? So that's to be some distinction. So one difference, of course, is you right now are not physically dependent on anyone else to survive. And you in utero were physically dependent on your mother to survive, at least before viability. Right? Because after viability, you could have been removed from your mother's uterus and you could have survived using technology. So one argument, and this was actually a very famous argument given by the court case Roe versus Wade that legalized abortion in 1973. They famously said that at the point of viability, the government could theoretically step in and protect unborn human life. So viability for them was the key sort of moment. Now viability, it turns out, though, is not a very good way to distinguish human beings who count from human beings who don't count, for several reasons. One of the reasons is this, that viability varies according to technology. So in the early 70s when Roe versus Wade came out, viability was around 28 weeks or so. Now viability has been pushed all the way down. Some babies even survive at before 22 weeks. As time continues, right now there are many researchers that I talk about in the book that are working on artificial uteruses. Now if that technology comes through, viability will be pushed all the way back to the very beginning of conception. But presumably the right to abortion doesn't depend on what the latest scientific, discovery is, right? And presumably people who are in favor of abortion wouldn't suddenly say, oh, well now I'm totally against abortion if in, Harvard or wherever they made an artificial womb. Secondly, viability also discriminates according to race, gender, and class. So the research shows that African American babies are viable earlier than white babies are, and that female babies are viable earlier than male babies are. And of course, if your parents are very rich and have access to the latest medical technology, then you would have been viable before someone who's very poor who does not have access to the high-tech incubators and so forth. So viability, so that second set of reasons doesn't work very well. The third reason viability doesn't work very well is that if you think about conjoined twins, which you mentioned, sometimes conjoined twins, you have one person who depends for their sustenance on someone else. So you might have, say, one conjoined twin that makes use of the other conjoined twin's lungs or heart. But no one would say, well, in that case, it's fine, perfectly fine to just kill this twin, right? No one would say that. So that also shows that merely being dependent on someone else does not thereby mean that you don't have a right to live or you're not a person. Because after all, many conjoined twins are just like us. They can talk and they get married and they do everything we do. So clearly just being dependent on someone else doesn't of itself mean you don't have a right to life. Yeah, Jim.
It strikes me as especially when it comes to the presidential election that's coming up, the most pertinent issue when it comes to abortion is not necessarily the question of whether or not it's life or whether or not it's a human,
right,
but rather the sort of collision of different rights. For example, the right of the mother to, in America at least, we have the unalienable rights, them being life, liberty, whatever, to pursue happiness. If your pursuit of happiness, say, clashes with the right of the life of the baby, or if you're, there's multiple different clashes that we can see,
right?
And which is why whenever Romney or even Scalia to a certain extent that has these very pro-life bents, they'll say, well, there's exceptions when it comes to rape or incest or whatever. So, is there a place for abortion in any society, given the fact that there's always going to be clashes of rights?
Yeah. No, I think you're right. There are clashes of rights, and I totally agree with you, and I think everyone agrees, that both men and women have a right to control their bodies. There's no doubt about that. That's clearly true. But we would both agree, I think, that, say, my right to control my body stops where your body begins. In other words, I can't control my body by punching you in the face or something, because you also have a right to bodily integrity, right? And that's true, again, for all persons. So if the human being in utero is a person, well, then the human being in utero also has a right to control his or her own body. That is to say, the human being in utero can't do anything, they can't control their body the way we can, but they certainly would have the same right that we would of bodily integrity. So it would be wrong, in other words, to forcibly injure, forcibly harm somebody else's body, whether they're in utero or out of utero. So I think you're right. There's a kind of clash of two different rights, the right to control your body and the right to live. But in a properly ordered political system, the more superior right takes precedence. So if you think about the clash between the right to liberty and the right to property, these are two important rights, and they're both legitimate. But in the case of slavery, these two came into conflict, right? The slave owner wanted their right to liberty and owned slaves. The slaves wanted their right to, the slaves wanted the right to liberty. The property owners wanted the right to own slaves. But the more important right is the right of liberty. Why? Well, because if you're not free, you can't even exercise any property rights. But the same reasoning applies to a clash between the right to life and the right to someone's happiness or body. That is to say, if you're not even alive, you can't exercise any of your other rights, including the right to control your body. So the right to life is like the foundation of a house. Your house, the windows aren't going to work, the door's not going to work, the roof's not going to be there, nothing's going to work if there's no foundation. If it's on sand or whatever, the whole house is going over. So you can't have any rights whatsoever to vote, to speak, to do anything unless you're alive. So the right to life has to be the most fundamental right because it's the right on which all other rights are based.
I guess the only other question I would have, if that's the case,
Yeah.
is you're right. And in the case of slavery, there was a clash, and obviously liberty is the one that we see
Right.
Prevails. But in the case of abortion, there's a third party, or at least a secondary party, that being the life of the mother, who has to carry this to term.
Right.
So it's different than slavery, because slavery was freeing one group of people from another.
Right.
Whereas abortion links two people together, the mother and the child.
Right.
So does the mother, being the vessel, have any sort of extra rights, being as though she's stuck with this thing for 9 months?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would say this. I would say that both biological fathers and biological mothers have serious duties to their own biological children. And so a biological father, if I were to go out tonight to some bar and meet some woman, and let's say before you know it, we're in the broom closet, and I use a condom, and I use sperm jelly, and I wrap myself with saran wrap to make sure nothing happens, and nevertheless she gets pregnant. If all that were to happen, I still would have a legal and a moral obligation to support that child. How? Well, legally in terms of child support, right? If you add up the child support payments, let's say I'm paying, $600 a month times 12 months a year times 18 years, you're talking about over $100,000 there. You're talking about some serious investment, as it were. And to be a minimally decent person, of course, I probably would agree with me, you have to do way more than just send a check. You have to be there for piano lessons and help them with their homework and all kinds of things that minimally decent fathers do, simply in virtue of being the biological father. I think it's also true that biological mothers have minimal duties to their own biological children. And those would include not having an abortion and also not harming the baby in utero through, for instance, abusing drugs or alcohol during pregnancy. So this is equal. Both biological fathers and biological mothers have duties to their offspring. And even if they use contraception, even if they didn't want to be pregnant, even if whatever, once a child is in existence, they have duties to not harm the child and to provide support for that child. Yes?
If the government makes an intervention and says that they do not allow abortion, then does the government have the responsibility to making sure that you provide good health care for the child, good education for the child, good parenting for the child? And how do you do that?
That's a good question. I would say that the role of government does not include raising my children. So if I have kids, I don't think it's the government's job, either the federal government or the state government, to provide my own kids with food.
You're not saying it's my right, as a parent to do these things. You're saying that the child has a right.
That's right.
To be alive. So then it also has the right to be educated and fed and loved.
That's right. And I would say that the duty of parents is to provide for their own children. That parents, in other words, if I father a child, I, the father of the child, have a duty to my own kid to feed my own kid, make sure my kid's educated, make sure my kid is in bed on time. I personally don't think it's the federal government's job to make sure my kid's in bed on time and getting good food and whatever. I think that's my job, my duty as a father. And I think that mothers have similar duties. So I would say there's definitely a huge role for government in supporting families, in making things safe, making sure there's less crime, lots of things like that. But I personally do not think it's the government's job to do that. And the reason is that I'm the one, and my wife, that caused this baby to be. So I, the the father and the mother, should take responsibility for it, not the government, not somebody else.
But the government is taking the responsibility of deciding that the child has to be born. So once you make that responsibility, it becomes the government's responsibility, not only the parents. Because many times, what do you do for a mom that refuses to take care of her child? You put her in jail.
Yeah, or drug-addicted mother, because, I mean, there are babies, unfortunately, born to
That's right.
people who don't have the capacity to care for them or love them. And
Yeah, no, that's right. And that's very, very sad. I mean, I think it's often that the parents really would like to help the child, but sometimes they have terrible drug addictions. And so it's horrible. It's really, really sad. So I would agree that in some cases, it's sad, but in some cases it's in the child's best interest to be removed from the care of their own biological father and mother. And I think that's really sad when that happens. So in a case like that, you have an abused child who's 3 and the parents are, whatever, making them smoke pot. I mean, you can imagine a horrible situation. Yeah, I think the government should protect children that are being physically abused or neglected, remove the children from their biological parents and take care of them.
All right, but right now we don't have a good social service department. Most children who go into any kind of foster care have something like an 85% chance of being sexually abused before the age of 6.
Mm-hmm.
How does the government take care of this child? Because it has said that it's very, it's a human being entitled to life, and life, not just, breathing, but it's entitled to grow and develop. So how does the government then guarantee it if it says that this child has to have life?
Well, the government already does that to a degree, right? In other words, the government, there are...
extremely poorly. We need, if we're going to legislate that we're giving life to a child, then we need to legislate, to be human, that this child has every opportunity, the same opportunity as if, any of my kids were when they were born.
Yeah, well, I think you're...
Equal.
I think you're right that the government... Well, no, I don't agree with that. I don't think it's the case that government has an obligation to provide everything for every child that I personally provide for my own kids. In other words, I don't think the government, like I read to my kids at night and pray with them. So should the government force parents to... What's that?
But then you're saying that they're second-class children.
No, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that we're disagreeing about the role of government. So on my idea, the government is very important, but has limited responsibilities that do not include actually raising children. And on my view, the government should, and does currently, step in whenever there's neglect or abuse of kids. But whether or not there's neglect or abuse of kids, that doesn't change the ethics of abortion. In other words, one of the arguments I talk about in the book is some people say that not only is abortion okay, but also infanticide is okay. And by infanticide, what I mean is killing a child after it's born. And you might be like, people think this? People really do think this. If you want to email me, I'll email you their articles. It really is a view that very prominent people hold. Now, clearly, I hope we'd agree, you could say, well, look, infanticide should be okay unless the government guarantees that every single child is raised in this sort of ideal way. Well, no, you can clearly say, look, infanticide is wrong and child neglect is wrong. And you could also hold it's not the government's job to ensure that every child receives whatever. I mean, I think there's definitely a minimum in terms of, yes, I hope everyone agrees that if parents are neglecting, abusing their children, that they should be criminally got in trouble, and the government needs to take them away and place them in another family. I think everyone would agree with that.
To sort of just link it to, wouldn't that minimum also include that the government would provide it, or not provide, ensure the opportunity of access to at least a minimum of things like decent education, right? And so clearly if the government is sort of insisting that abortion would be illegal and certain children would be born who otherwise wouldn't be born, that they'll have access to a basic level of education, and a basic level of care, so that if they're born to mothers or fathers who are not capable or don't live up to their responsibilities, that they don't completely fall into destitution.
Yeah, I think I could agree with that. I think we might have to discuss the kind of details of it, but in principle that sounds reasonable. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read your book, and I need you to clarify for me.
Okay, sure.
You've given a scientific viewpoint,
right.
But do you posit completely in your book that abortion should be illegal and enforced by the government?
No, actually, my book focuses exclusively on the ethics or morality of abortion. I did not get into the legality of it, and not because I don't care, it's just that to have a book of a reasonable length, you need to kind of limit your focus. So what I'm talking about in this book is exclusively the idea that abortion is morally wrong. And it's morally wrong for the same reason it's wrong morally to kill a newborn baby. That newborn babies, even though they're different than we are in radical ways, right? They can't talk, they're not even aware of who they are, they can't communicate, they can't, decide things on themselves, that they have the same basic equal rights as everybody else. So in the book, I definitely I just don't talk about it. I don't take a position for or against legalized abortion. But my view is that abortion ought to be illegal. And the reason is that I think part of the government's role is to protect the fundamental rights of all citizens, including citizens that are defenseless. So the fact that someone is mentally handicapped and can't defend themselves, the fact that someone is an infant and can't defend him or herself, the fact that someone is in utero and can't defend him or herself, I think is irrelevant. That part of a good government's role is to ensure that persons in the country do not deprive other persons of their life, of their liberty, or of their property. Right? That's a fundamental wrong. And that's part of what government, I think, should do. In other words, part of the role of government, I think, is to protect people in terms of their life. In other words, the government should try to prevent murders, and if they catch people murdering, stop them, prevent theft, prevent assault, and abortion as the intentional killing of a human being prior to birth is similar in kind to these other kinds of serious injustices done by one person to another. Yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah. Sure.
Our legal system and our policing system does not do a preventive job in any way, shape, or form. You cannot call the police unless a crime has been committed.
Right.
They will not accept anything except a report of a crime already committed. So
Right.
You're positing that the government should protect the incapable of protecting themselves, but it doesn't even pretend to protect those of us who just walk down the street and get mugged or whatever, It doesn't even go there at all. It has nothing in place for that. So why should it have it in place for this?
Well, no, I don't think it should be in place for this. I'm not talking about before anyone does anything, getting them in trouble. Just like with theft. Theft is, you're exactly right. Now, police don't arrest you for, you may commit a theft sometime, so we're going to arrest you. You have to commit a theft, and then you would get in trouble. So in my view, and again, it's not in the book, but my view would be, if an abortionist performs an abortion after he or she does that, well, then after, they should get in trouble, just like with theft. Not as a prospective thing, but after the deed is done. So it would be similar to every other crime. Yeah.
What if it's known before the baby is born that it has no brain, it's terribly mangled, it has DNA or genetic problems that will make it suffer when it is born, and it's just going to be a catastrophic life when it's born?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in about less than 1% of cases, there are serious fetal anomalies. And you're absolutely right. There are really horrible, horrible, horrible cases that take place where someone has terrible, terrible suffering and they can't do much, etc. I think that's absolutely true. Now, it's also true that sometimes, and you probably know this, in birth, the umbilical cord wraps around the child's neck, and the child's perfectly fine in utero, but when the child gets born, the child is basically suffocated. And sometimes the child is born and lives, but has been oxygen deprived for however long it's been oxygen deprived for. This is really, really, really hard and horrible. And I actually know a case of this. I know a case where the child was perfectly fine in utero, but in the process of being born had this terrible oxygen deprivation. So this child now is 20 years old, and I know this family well. The child is in diapers still. The child can't talk. The child can't walk, etc. So very, very, very severely handicapped. Now, on my view, Bryce, this child is severely handicapped, has an equal right to live with me. I'm no more important as a person than he is. I have no more rights or dignity than he does. We have equal basic human rights. And the fact is, on my view at least, that being severely physically or mentally handicapped does not make you a second-class citizen or make you not count and not be worthy. And so in my view...
If you're in suffering and pain...
Yeah, so this child that I know, Bryce, I mean, he's 20 years old in a diaper. This is not fun. This is very unpleasant, and for him and his parents. But again, in my view, regardless of how severe your mental or physical handicap is, all human beings deserve basic rights and basic dignity. So, if that view is correct, for a child like Bryce, who was born, and in the process of getting born had this handicap arise, the very same thing is true prior to birth. So, in my view, all human beings, regardless of their level of handicap, deserve respect and deserve kindness and deserve basic help. So if someone's in pain, the solution to that is to try to alleviate their pain. If you've got any sort of human problem, we should always, if we're trying to be people of justice, try to help the human being involved. We don't get rid of human problems by eliminating the human. We try to eliminate the problems.
But if there is no solution?
Well, in terms of pain relief, I'm not a physician, but as far as I know, given present medical technology, it is actually not the case that people have to ever suffer physical pain. I mean, if someone is suffering pain, it's because the pain relief is not being adequate. So in my view, whether it's a newborn baby, whether it's an 80-year-old person, if you're suffering in pain and you want pain relief, or if you can't talk, you ought to be provided pain relief by physicians. So that would be true regardless of your age or your disability. Yeah.
I would just like to make two distinctions that I think a lot of us are getting confused. The quality of life that one believes one is entitled to by the government is completely subjective, and I don't think that's what your book seems to be focusing on, the quality of life that the government guarantees. I think it's just about the basic right to life that universally people acknowledge.
Yeah, I mean, in my view, I think it's true that people's quality of life varies quite radically. So you can have a very high quality of life, a medium quality of life, or a terrible quality of life. And so there's lots of differences in terms of that. But our fundamental dignity does not depend on how much pain or pleasure we are enjoying or not enjoying at that moment. Our fundamental dignity rests on the kind of beings that we are as human beings. So in the case of someone who has a low quality of life, in my view, we shouldn't try to kill that person, but what we should do is try to help that person and help them to achieve a higher quality of life. But regardless of whether or not we can do that, we ought to always refrain from harming or killing that person. We should always try to help rather than harm. And so, yeah, it's certainly true. There's innumerable degrees of being physically or mentally handicapped, from being perfectly healthy, perfectly sound, to being like my friend Bryce, or even worse than him. But none of that is relevant to whether we have fundamental dignity and rights, whether it's okay for somebody else, especially in the case of abortion or infanticide, somebody else without authorization from us to kill us. I mean, we might have a debate about euthanasia, like, well, what if I want to die? Okay, well, we could debate about that. But in this case, the person has not voluntarily said, I want to die. So it's clearly somebody else who's making a decision, I think your life's not worth living. And again, we wouldn't do that with any adult. We wouldn't even do that with a newborn and allow someone else to kill a newborn baby. And since there's no morally significant difference between a newborn baby and a baby in utero, we ought not to do that in the case of abortion. I think you had a question, though. I don't know if we...
No, that's okay.
It's gone, okay. Jimmy.
Well, I guess the other it was an issue in California a couple of years ago where they had a proposition saying that if you are under a certain age, I think it was 16 or so, you had to tell your parents you're having an abortion. The reason being is that oftentimes there are other consequences for having a kid that do not relate to the child, but rather relate to the mother. That being beaten by your dad if you're in a very strict household. That would be, say, if you're raped or if someone had incest, it could be damage to your body. So again, I guess my concern is more with the mother. In other words, yes, the baby absolutely has a right to life, but being as though the mother is already alive, she has other rights that exist outside of the baby. If the baby didn't even exist at all, you want the mother doesn't, she can't get punched and then that kind of thing. So, what about the mom, and how do these rights extend to her?
Yeah, well, I would say that all women, like all human beings, have equal basic rights. So there are certain rights you get in addition to your basic rights. So by basic rights, what I mean is things like the right not to be killed, the right to live, the right not to be enslaved, the right to liberty, the right not to be mutilated, the right to bodily integrity. So I think all human beings have that. Now, women would have additional rights on top of that. So, for instance, we gain at 16 the possibility of having a right to drive. We gain at 18 the possibility of the right to vote. We gain at 25 the right to be in the House of Representatives, at 30 to be a senator, at 35 to be president. So we gain rights, and that's perfectly appropriate. But our basic rights are something that all human beings ought to enjoy. So women certainly have many rights that a newborn baby or a baby in utero would not have. All kinds of rights, to vote, to drive, to run for office, tons of things. But the basic rights are something that are shared by all human beings. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if there's, say we have a mother has a miscarriage and
Right.
her life and the baby's life is threatened, and you can only save one in this hypothetical scenario.
Right.
I'm going to say I know much about that, but who in your opinion would be saved under your ethics of inclusion? Because in theory, both of them would. But if you had to choose one,
Yeah.
I think we go towards the mother, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the book, I do talk about this. So this is extremely rare, but unfortunately, there are cases where a choice has to be made between the life of the mother and the life of the child in utero. I'll give you one example. Sometimes women get cancer of the uterus, and a doctor might come to such a woman and say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, you've got cancer of the uterus. We're faced with a horrible decision. Either you remove the uterus and thereby get rid of all the cancer, and that will stop the cancer and you'll live. But in that case, the baby, if it's not viable yet, will die. Or we do not remove the uterus. We allow the baby to continue to develop, and then at viability, we remove the baby, and as a result, the woman will die." Now, in a situation like that, on my view, either course of action is morally acceptable. That is to say, either course of action is morally okay. Why? Well, because abortion, as I define it in the book, is intentional taking of the life of a human being prior to birth. So it has to be on purpose, as a means or as an end. So in the case I just described, the woman who removes her uterus is not intentionally killing the child in utero. In other words, that's not her means, it's not her end, it's not her goal. It's an unfortunate side effect of what she's doing. So what this means, in other words, is that it's morally permissible to do one action that has two effects, one good and one bad, so long as the bad effect is not something that you choose as a means or as an end, and you have a serious reason for allowing the bad effect. So in the case that I just described, a woman could remove the cancerous uterus, and her intention is good. She's doing a morally good thing to remove cancer. Nothing wrong with that at all. Unfortunately, as a side effect, the baby ends up dying. But abortion is defined as intentional killing of the child prior to birth, not killing it, or not doing something that as a side effect ends up killing the baby. On the other hand, if the woman does not remove her uterus, that too is morally okay. Why? Well, she's not committing suicide, right? In other words, her death is not the goal, the means, or the end she's using. She's willing to accept that as an unfortunate side effect, but it's not her goal. Her death is not the means or the end. And she has a serious reason for allowing that bad side effect, namely that she wants to preserve the life of her child. So in my view, in a case like that, either course of action is morally fine. Neither is wrong. Both are okay. So it's really up to her. So you can imagine some cases in which a woman might say, look, this is my third bout with cancer. Not only do I have uterine cancer, I have breast cancer and brain cancer. The doctor says even if I have my uterus removed, I'm going to die within 3 months anyway. I'm just going to give this baby a chance to live. Perfectly fine. On the other hand, she might say, look, I want to live. I don't want this baby to die, but, it's fine for her to give priority in terms of the medical procedure to removing the cancer. So that's fine too. Either way, what she does is fine. So basically, in these cases of putting the life of in cases in which the mother's life is endangered, any legitimate medical treatment can be done to save the mother's life, and so long as it's not intentionally killing the child. And I know of no case in which it's necessary to make the child dead. That is to try to kill the baby in order to save the woman's life. So all the cases are these cases of double effect, where you're doing one action that has an unfortunate side effect, and those are morally permissible.
About one more.
Oh,
So,
right. Dr. Tree.
what about What about back to the definitions of life, right?
Yeah.
What about people who would say, and this is a multi-pronged, that one of the criteria we need to take into account is sentience.
Right.
That people actually have the ability to feel pain. And part of the reason I want to ask this question is the complexity of abortion itself. And part of the reason I want to ask it is the sort of, I won't say unjustified, but not yet established priority for why specifically human life should be important instead of other sorts of life.
Yeah.
And I know you've worked on dignity in other
Right,
areas, so
right.
I'm kind of curious what your...
Good. Okay, great question. So if I understood you correctly, well, why not say that sentience is the key feature? So sentience, by sentience you mean, some people do say, yeah, right, that sentience would be your ability to experience, say, pain. Why doesn't that make you into a being? So if that view were true, then you say something like, well, abortion is morally fine until the human being in utero can experience pain. And there's some debate about when that happens. Some people say it's early in pregnancy, about 8 weeks. Some people say it's much later in pregnancy, about 25, 28 weeks. So there's kind of a debate. I would say sentience is a very poor way of assigning value for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is this. This is rare. But there are some human beings who are born who do not experience any pain whatsoever. It's called chronic insensitivity to pain syndrome. It's a very rare syndrome that almost always only children have. And the reason is that they seldom survive to adulthood. But these children literally are missing the enzymes that are necessary to experience pain. So, you know, when you cut your fingernails or cut your hair, you don't feel any pain at all. Perfectly doesn't harm you one bit. But for these people, you could cut off their finger, you could cut off the whole arm, and it'd be like them getting a haircut, or like you getting a haircut or getting your fingernails done. They experience no pain whatsoever. And these are children that run, that talk, that are exactly like children, other children, except for they experience no pain. But I think it's clearly the case, as I've heard say, well, these kids, since they don't experience pleasure and pain, we can just kill them whenever we want to. The other reason I think it doesn't work, so it's under-inclusive. In other words, it excludes beings like these poor children with chronic insensitivity to pain syndrome that clearly are persons. The other problem with it is it's over-inclusive. If you use a can of Raid, for instance, at a picnic, and you look at what's happening with the bugs the ants that are in your salad or whatever, you'll see that some ants are dead, but some ants aren't dead. And what are they doing? They're like going, ah. No, they're not saying that. But insects experience discomfort. I mean, I think it's pretty clear. If you see insects that are injured, they do just what we would do if someone sprayed a can of Raid on us or cut off our arm or whatever. But clearly, we can't say, well, every ant has a right to life, right? Right to life for wasps and mosquitoes. They experience pleasure and pain, but they do not have basic human rights. The third
some
reason,
people do say that, though. They don't have human rights, but they've got a right not to experience.
No, that's right. No, you're right. Some people do say that. They say every living thing has an equal right to live. But personally, I'm guessing most people here do not think wasps or mosquitoes have a right to live. So if you do, then I guess the argument won't work for you. The third thing, though, is this: that whatever it is that gives us our dignity and our rights should be something we share equally. So, for instance, let's say it was intelligence, and that's what makes you valuable. It's very clear that our intelligence is not something that's shared equally, right? There's some people that are really gifted in music, and then there's me. There's some people who are really, really talented in terms of art, and then there's me. So there's lots of people who are incredibly gifted, incredibly intelligent, and more intelligent, say, than us. And if we took IQ tests or EQ tests or whatever kind of measure of intelligence you wanted, I imagine all of us would have slightly different scores. But all of us here, I'm sure we all agree, have equal basic rights to live. But our equal basic rights to live cannot be based on something that varies so radically like this. Now, sentience is, again, something that varies radically. Some people are more sensitive to pain than other people are. And for all of us, we can be made temporarily entirely non-sensitive to pain, like when we're in surgery. But clearly, we don't want to say our right to live, we have it right now, and if we go in surgery, all of a sudden we lose it, and then we get it back when we come out of surgery, and then if we go in surgery again, we lose it again. That clearly doesn't work. So whatever it is that gives us our basic rights has to be something that is steady. That is to say, that's not episodically related to us coming and going. So what is that? What I would say gives us our right to live is having a rational nature. And that's why, in my view, it's not the case that only human beings ought to be respected. Any being whatsoever in the whole universe who has a rational nature ought to be accorded basic respect. So you may believe in these beings, you may not. You may think there's aliens that are intelligent. Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. I don't know. But if there are, well, then they would have equal basic rights with everybody else. So it's not the functioning or the exercise of rationality that gives us our rights, but it's having that basic intrinsic nature. And what I mean by nature is the interior principles of the standard, that is to say, by which we would judge our flourishing. So our flourishing as a kind of thing, a human being, consists in rational activity. And any other being who has a similar standard of flourishing, has a similar nature, would share in basic rights. Now, they wouldn't be human rights if they're aliens, but they would share in that basic thing. So it's not a human being unique characteristic. So all human beings would have it, but I'm open to the idea that there are other non-human beings that would have it too. And we might debate, do dolphins have rational nature? Do gorillas? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But undoubtedly, we human beings have rational nature. Again, we have rational nature from the very beginning of our lives all the way through, even though we're not always doing the characteristic acts of rationality. In a similar way, we have a sexual nature as male or female in the very beginning of our lives all the way through it. Now, we're not always doing sexual acts, but we are sexual beings in the sense of male or female from the very beginning. When we're babies, before we're babies, even when we were first conceived at one cell, we are being sexual, male or female, was already there. Now, again, we were doing anything about it, but that's a distinct thing. So we are rational beings from the very beginning of our lives all the way through to the very end of our lives, even though we're not always functioning in a rational way, talking and doing arguments and things like that. Any other questions? Yes?
So I'm curious how, just about your thoughts that your work has been critically acclaimed and is also being used as a part of a political agenda for those who are arguing that abortion is a very political issue, who other parts of their platforms do not have the inclusivity upon which your work is based.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about your thoughts about that, because you do provide a very compelling kind of scientific and academic argument for a case that in many cases that doesn't seem to have a lot of reason in other arenas. So I'm just curious if you can speak to that.
Sure.
A little bit.
Yeah. So obviously
that disconnect.
Yeah. So obviously tonight there's a presidential debate, and so this is obviously in people's minds. I think that's absolutely true. I guess what I would say is this, and this is sort of a bigger question. When it comes to voting, there's different points of view, right? So one point of view would be you look at a candidate and you take into account all the different positions. And then you sort of add it up and see, well, in general, is this candidate better than this candidate? But there's another way of looking at it, too, where you would say, regardless of other positions, if you hold certain positions, that's kind of a disqualifier. You'd say, I just couldn't support that person. So let me give you an example. During the Vietnam War, there were some people who absolutely said to themselves, look, I cannot vote for Johnson, even though he's a Democrat, even though he has other things that I like, even though he does whatever else I like in terms of the economy or in terms of healthcare or in terms of education, I can't vote for him. Why? Because he supports the Vietnam War, right? And I think that's a morally legitimate position. If you really think the Vietnam War is intentionally killing innocent people, well, then it seems to me that it makes sense to say you can't vote for that person. And abortion may not be that kind of issue for you. In other words, you may not think of it similar to Vietnam War. But if you did, well, then it would make sense to sort of focus and say, well, look, I think that issue is so important that I want to vote for this. And I think for all of us here, whether or not you're a one-issue voter or you take one issue as more important than others, I think for all of us here, we probably agree that there would be some things that if a person held this view and advocated this view, that would just say you just could not support it. So, for instance, no candidate holds this really in this election. But let's say there was a candidate who said, look, I really think, and this was true in the United States, right? There were candidates, many candidates, presidential candidates, who defended slavery. Right? I mean, look at the Lincoln Douglas debates. They had an hours-long debate about whether slavery should be legal or not. And one candidate said it shouldn't be, one candidate said it was. So I hope if I were alive at that time, I would say, look, Douglas, I think your position on whatever, railroad reform is great, but you're for slavery. I'm sorry, I just can't support that at all. I hope I would have had that point of view. Now, if my position is correct, abortion is similar to slavery in the sense of it's a very, very serious injustice that the government permits private citizens to do one against another. So if that view is correct, that would seem to call into question the kind of balancing where you say, well, candidate X is so good on, I don't know, teaching kindergarten public schools or something, that I just have to go with them. Right? Because this one issue is a matter of fundamental justice. Again, like slavery, where it would be a disqualifier. So it kind of depends on your point of view. I would say this, though. For almost everyone, there is some kind of issue that would be a disqualifier, whether it's slavery or whether it's abortion or whatever. And so it would depend on what you thought abortion was.
Yeah. Well, the big issue that those who are very pro-life have, they're also typically very anti-gay marriage. And so that is at odds with the inclusivity that you're arguing about in this particular book.
Right.
I haven't read the book yet, so so that seems to be really, and I guess that the convenience of that is that they're probably not touting the inclusivity message of your book. It would work. It would be the other messages.
Well, this is
that's what I'm wondering about that.
That makes sense. Okay. I wasn't exactly sure what you're talking about. Okay, that makes sense. this is a very, very important point. I teach a whole course here on love and marriage, and we spend a few weeks actually talking about, well, what exactly is marriage? And we look at same-sex marriage, polygamous marriage, divorce, cohabitation. We look at just all kinds of issues. So I think this is a great, great question, extremely important. But I do think, like tonight, I'd sort of like to maybe, but we can't really go into the whole, just because it's sort of a whole different thing. But I think the basic response would be to say that those two issues are distinct, and those are not really equivalent. So in other words, there's no contradiction between saying every single human being should have equal basic fundamental rights, like the right to not be killed, the right not to be enslaved, etc., and also holding that we ought not to redefine marriage and undermine the definition of marriage as between one man and one woman. Now, why do I say that? Well, let's change the subject slightly. Let's say, and there are people in the country that want this, let's say we're talking about the issue of marriage, say the debate was about whether marriage should be between two people or more than two people. Right? Because there are some people who have polygamous marriages. You see Big Love on TV and sister wives, I think, is another one. So this is an issue that people talk about. Now, it would make sense, I'm sure you would agree, to say, well, look, if you're for inclusion and equality, we ought to also include these people's desires for what marriage ought to be. Right? So it seems to me you can affirm fundamental basic human rights for everybody and also say we ought not to redefine what marriage is. So again, it's a different debate, and I'd love to talk to you about it sometime. And maybe actually have this other book, and I have a whole chapter on same-sex marriage. And maybe next year or whatever, I'll have a chance to come back. But I don't see any contradiction whatsoever between inclusion for basic human rights and also not wanting to redefine marriage. After all, President Obama, as you probably know, has revolved his view on this issue 3 times. When he first got into political life, he was in favor of same-sex marriage. Then when he ran for president, he said, oh, now I'm against same-sex marriage. And then, of course, about a month ago, he revolved again and now is back in favor of same-sex marriage. So President Obama's views don't seem to be really a heroic Lincoln-esque championing of the ethics of inclusion. He seems to have had views based on the